Welcome to the deep dive. We're really excited about the stuff you sent over. It's quite the collection.
Yeah, it is.
It really is a fascinating set of information about a topic, frankly, I think we all know is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And we're gonna unpack it for you. We're gonna take all this information and we're gonna pull out the key takeaways. The idea is to, get you up to speed quickly and thoroughly.
It's a shortcut to really knowing your stuff about this topic.
Yeah. You could consider us your personal guides. We've spent some time with it.
Yeah.
And we're here to take you on a deep dive into it.
Indeed. A deep dive designed specifically for you.
Yes, indeed. And the topic for today is the profound influence of mainstream media on human life.
It's really interesting, just the sheer variety of sources that you provided. It kind of gives you a sense of how wide-reaching this whole topic is.
Oh, absolutely. It's interwoven with almost every aspect of our daily experience. And that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to explore the many ways it shapes our world. I mean, we're talking everything from how we choose our leaders to what products we buy, our understanding of education, you name it, and much, much more.
That's right.
We've really tried to pull out some interesting nuggets from this pile of information, and we're gonna break it down for you. We're not gonna overwhelm you, but we're gonna kind of give you the full picture.
Exactly. A clear, concise, and accurate summary of all the key findings.
Yes. Okay. So to kick things off, let's delve into the nuts and bolts of how mainstream media really shapes the political landscape. And I think the first place to start is really with elections. How does this work?
Well, one fundamental way is through what's known as agenda setting.
Yeah.
Basically, the issues that mainstream media chooses to give prominent coverage to, those are the ones that tend to become the issues that voters consider most important.
It's kind of like a spotlight, right?
Exactly. Whatever they shine the light on, that's what captures our attention.
Yeah. So if news organizations are constantly highlighting, let's say healthcare costs leading up to an election, that's going to become a major factor in how voters evaluate the different candidates.
Right, and their platform.
And their platforms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is, and a couple of your sources brought this up, this isn't always an example of deliberate manipulation. Sometimes it just reflects, basic journalistic judgments about what's newsworthy.
Right.
But the point is, the effect is still the same, right? By highlighting certain issues, they kind of set the terms of the political debate.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that can have a big impact on, what voters think about when they go to the polls.
It does. One of the things your sources pointed out that was really interesting was that, the power of agenda setting isn't uniform.
Right.
It really depends on how relevant the issue is to you personally, the individual, and how certain you already feel about it. So if it's something that's really impacting your life directly, and you're looking for more information about it, you're more likely to be influenced by how the media is presenting it.
Exactly.
That was a really interesting point. And speaking of how information is presented, framing is another really big factor, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's not just what the media covers, but it's the specific angle, the context they give it,
That's right.
How they kind of wrap that information up in a way that makes sense to us.
Yeah, it's really about how they present the information, the language they use, the visuals they choose, the whole narrative they build around a particular event or even, a political figure. And that can have a huge impact on how the public perceives things.
Yeah. One of your sources talked about horse race coverage during elections.
Oh, yeah.
That's where the media focuses pretty much exclusively on who's ahead in the polls and kind of the strategy and the tactics of the campaigns.
Like it's a sporting event.
Well, it's a sporting event, yeah. And that kind of framing, the sources pointed out, it can actually have a really negative effect.
Right.
By constantly focusing on the polls and the tactics rather than the issues.
Right.
It can make people cynical about the whole process.
Again.
They start to think that elections are just about, political gamesmanship rather than, the real issues that are facing people.
Right.
And that can lead to, disengagement, people not even bothering to vote.
Yeah, lower voter turnout.
Yeah, lower voter turnout. Exactly. It's really kind of a shift away from the substance and more towards just the more superficial aspects of the campaign. Okay. Now, what about endorsements? Do you think, do newspaper endorsements still have any power?
Your sources actually suggested that even though their influence may have diminished somewhat in the digital age, editorial endorsements, particularly from some of the more established newspapers, they can still play a role, especially for those voters who are still undecided.
Right.
It's one factor among many, but it can be a tipping point for some.
Yeah, it can be something they take into account. Now, we've also got, the ever-increasing presence of partisan media outlets.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to kind of add a whole other layer of complexity to things.
It really does. They tend to reinforce the biases of their audience.
Yeah.
And your sources actually indicated that they can be quite effective at increasing negative views of opposing candidates.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they really kind of push those buttons. And that can contribute to this whole polarized climate that we see.
Right.
And it also makes it more difficult to achieve any kind of balanced reporting.
Right.
Avoid those false equivalencies.
Right. Like giving equal weight to, a claim that's based on evidence and one that's just demonstrably false.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of false information, we have to talk about the very serious issue of disinformation and misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Mainstream media, they're not entirely immune to that either, are they?
Unfortunately, no.
They generally try to stick to, some kind of journalistic standards.
They do.
But even they can fall prey to amplifying false narratives.
Right.
Especially, in this incredibly fast-paced digital world.
Yes.
Where unverified information can just spread like wildfire on social media.
It's almost instantaneous.
Yeah.
Your sources actually brought up specific examples from, I believe, the 2020 and 2024 election cycles.
Oh, wow.
Where, false claims gained traction and even ended up shaping media coverage.
Yeah. It's almost like this vicious cycle,
It is.
One of the things that one of your sources pointed out was, the decline in public trust in traditional media can actually lead people to get their news from non-mainstream sources.
Ironically,
which might have even weaker fact-checking processes.
Right. They might not even have any.
Exactly. So it's almost like, it's like a catch-22.
It is a bit of a catch-22. And what makes it even more challenging, and a lot of your sources brought this up, is these tactics are constantly evolving.
Right.
We're seeing increasingly sophisticated approaches. I mean, look at AI-generated fake content.
Yeah, that stuff's getting incredibly convincing.
It really is. You see these videos, you hear these audio clips. It's almost impossible to tell the difference between what's real and what's not.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder, so what's the overall picture?
Right.
If we kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of how people are getting their political information these days, what does that even look like?
Well, your sources really highlighted this significant shift towards digital devices, smartphones, tablets, and social media platforms as primary news sources. So, you've got this complex interplay now where social media, on the one hand, offers this potential for direct engagement.
Yeah.
You can actually interact with candidates.
Right.
But at the same time, it's also this breeding ground for misinformation.
Right.
And then you've got traditional media, the TV networks, the newspapers, still kind of setting the overall agenda.
Yeah.
They're the ones framing the conversations that we're having.
Right.
So it's a very dynamic, very fluid situation.
Okay. So, the impact on elections is clear, but what about, our opinions and beliefs beyond politics, like, consumer choices? How does mainstream media play a role there?
Well, advertising is really a cornerstone of mainstream media, right? That's how they make their money.
Right.
And advertising has a huge influence on our opinions about products.
Mm-hmm.
Your sources really went into detail about the different techniques that advertisers use. They appeal to our emotions, they use celebrity endorsements, they repeat their messages over and over again, all with the goal of creating product awareness.
Right.
Getting information out there, appealing to our desires, building brand loyalty.
Yeah. We've all seen those ads, the ones that are trying to make you feel a certain way about a product.
Exactly.
Or, the ones with the famous people telling you why you need to buy something.
Right. And those techniques, they can be very effective at getting people interested and driving sales. But your sources also raise some pretty serious ethical questions.
Oh, really?
Like, are they manipulating us? Are their claims deceptive? Are they setting up unrealistic expectations about what a product can actually do?
Interesting.
It's something to think about for sure.
Yeah. And do you think, celebrity endorsements, do you think they still have the power they used to?
I think there's a shift happening.
Uh-huh.
A lot of your sources pointed to this growing skepticism towards traditional celebrity endorsement.
Interesting.
People are maybe starting to see them as less trustworthy compared to, say, recommendations from social media influencers. Because influencers are, they're seen as more authentic.
Right.
They're more relatable.
Yeah, it's like they're one of us.
Yeah, it's like, a friend is recommending something.
Yeah.
And we tend to trust our friends more than we trust, a celebrity who's being paid to say something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what about product reviews in mainstream media?
Oh, yeah.
Like, those reviews you see in newspapers and magazines and online. Do you think those carry weight?
Oh, they definitely do. In fact, your sources suggest that they can actually be more influential than company marketing or even personal recommendations. Yeah, they're really powerful. And with the rise of online reviews and all that user-generated content, it's just exploded.
Yeah.
People really trust those online reviews. They feel like they're getting the collective wisdom of all these other people who have tried the product.
Yeah.
And I know I do it.
Yeah, me too. Before I buy almost anything these days,
Right.
I look at the reviews online. Yeah. And it's interesting because your sources pointed out that both positive and negative reviews can have a big impact.
They can.
And even those humorous reviews, the ones that aren't even really serious.
Yeah.
They can still influence people's behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing, really.
Yeah. But there's also this concern now, right?
Yeah.
About the reliability of all these online reviews.
It's right.
Because with the advances in AI, you can actually generate really convincing fake reviews.
Yeah, it's hard to know what's real and what's not anymore.
Yeah, that's true. So it's another area where, a healthy dose of skepticism is probably a good thing.
For sure.
Now, you mentioned influencers before.
Right.
And your analysis also talked about influencer marketing as kind of like a growing trend. So how does that fit into the whole mainstream media landscape?
Well, your sources kind of positioned it as this modern evolution of the celebrity endorsement. So you've got these influencers who cultivate these huge online followings.
Right.
And their followers see them as authentic.
Yeah.
And they engage with them directly. So their endorsements carry a lot of weight.
Right, because there's that sense of personal connection and trust. So it's almost like a trusted friend recommending something.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about education.
Okay.
Mainstream media plays a role in how we understand education too, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And your sources highlighted this interesting thing. They pointed out that news coverage of education often tends to focus on the negatives.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the challenges, the shortcomings, the controversies. And that can actually contribute to what they call a perception gap.
The perception gap.
Yeah, where the public's view of schools and teachers is actually more negative than the reality of what's happening in classrooms.
Yeah, that's a shame.
It is. It's not good for teacher morale.
Right.
And it can undermine public confidence in the whole system.
Right. Now, on a more positive note, you also talked about the role of documentaries in shaping our understanding of education.
Right. They can actually be quite powerful. They can showcase innovative approaches, raise important ethical questions, influence policy discussions,
right,
and even just kind of demystify complex topics.
Right. You're right.
And documentaries offer this really immersive learning experience, through storytelling and real-world perspective.
Yeah.
So they can be really effective.
And of course, we shouldn't forget about all the educational programming that's available on, television and online.
Especially public broadcasting.
Yes, especially public broadcasting.
They provide such high-quality educational content, and it's really valuable for learners of all ages. And your sources pointed out that it can be especially helpful in closing achievement gaps.
Right.
For younger students.
Yeah. Okay. So, it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to media and education.
No, not at all.
Now, your analysis also touched upon how mainstream media kind of contributes to shaping our broader social norms and cultural values. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The way different groups are portrayed in media, the behaviors that are shown, it all influences how we think about things. Like, gender roles, expectations around body image, norms for social interactions, all that stuff.
Right.
But here's the thing, and a lot of your sources brought this up, this increasing reliance on social media. It's actually leading to what they call audience fragmentation.
Audience fragmentation, okay.
Yeah, and the formation of echo chambers. So people are, they're basically only being exposed to viewpoints that align with their own beliefs. And they're not getting that diversity of perspectives.
Right.
And that's a concern.
Yeah, it is. And I guess, the commercial nature of mainstream media also plays a role here, doesn't it?
It does. The drive to attract those big audiences. It can lead to a preference for, sensationalism or really easily digestible content rather than, the more nuanced and complex stuff.
Right. And that can really affect how we understand, important social issues.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more really interesting idea that I want to get into.
Okay.
This idea of mainstream media acting as a fourth branch of government.
That's a pretty powerful analogy, isn't it?
It is. The idea is that mainstream media acts as this watchdog, right? It holds the other three branches accountable, legislative, the executive, the judicial.
Right.
It scrutinizes what they do. It informs the public.
Right.
It plays this really crucial role in shaping public discourse and influencing policy.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of a free press being essential for a well-informed citizenry, that's really central to this concept.
Right. But you also presented some arguments against actually considering the media to be a formal branch of government.
Well, yeah, because unlike the other branches, the media isn't elected.
Right.
And it's not subject to the same kinds of regulation.
Yeah.
And then there's always this concern about bias. The influence of media owners and advertisers.
Yeah.
Some people argue that if the press itself becomes a political player, then it can't really be an effective watchdog.
Right.
It loses its neutrality. Yeah. And it was interesting. Your analysis actually pointed out the difference between the term fourth branch, which sometimes implies a lack of independence, and fourth estate, which emphasizes the autonomy of the press.
Right. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And of course, we have to remember that the U.S. Constitution, it establishes those three branches of government very clearly.
Right.
But it doesn't really say anything about the role of the press.
Right. Although it does protect its freedom.
It does. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, that's all in there.
Yeah. Okay, so if it's not a formal branch of government, then how do you see it functioning?
Well, it's more like an informal check on power. It's not officially part of the system, but it still plays this really important role.
Yeah.
And your sources actually provided some great historical examples, like the Watergate scandal.
Oh, right.
And the revelations of the NSA surveillance program.
Right. Where journalists really played a key role in uncovering the truth.
Exactly. They investigated wrongdoing. They brought it to the public's attention.
Yeah.
And that's really the power of a free press.
Right.
And I think that whole debate, about fourth estate versus fourth branch, it really reflects these different perspectives on how the media relates to power structures. But here's the thing, and this is something your analysis really emphasized. Declining public trust in the media, it can actually weaken its effectiveness as a watchdog.
Right. Because if people don't trust the messenger, they're not going to believe the message.
Exactly. And then you add to that, the rise of this whole alternative facts thing.
Right.
Rejection of mainstream narratives.
Yeah.
Really makes it difficult to even have a shared understanding of reality.
Right.
Which is kind of essential for a functioning democracy.
It is. Okay. We've talked about a lot of the positive and negative aspects of mainstream media.
Right.
But we also need to talk about the profit motive. The fact that most mainstream media is driven by the need to make money.
Right.
How does that affect things?
Well, the pursuit of profit, it can have a big influence on what we see and read and hear. There's this constant pressure to attract large audiences.
Right.
And generate revenue. And that can sometimes lead to, prioritizing sensational stories, clickbait headlines.
Right.
Rather than in-depth, well-researched journalism.
Yeah.
it's a constant balancing act.
Right.
Trying to fulfill the public's need for information while also making sure the media outlet can actually stay in business.
Yeah.
Right.
And the vested interests of the media owners, the advertisers, they can play a role too, right?
Well, absolutely.
I mean, with this increasing concentration of media ownership, there's definitely a concern about whether we're getting a diversity of viewpoints. Are these big corporations prioritizing their own agendas over the public interest?
Right. I mean, are they suppressing stories that might be damaging to them?
Yeah.
Or, pushing stories that benefit them?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the things that your analysis mentioned was this idea of a self-reinforcing loop in media consumption.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain what that means?
Sure. It's this tendency that people have to gravitate towards media outlets that already align with their beliefs.
Right.
So they're not really getting exposed to different perspectives.
Right.
And that just reinforces their existing views.
Yeah.
And it contributes to those echo chambers that we talked about earlier.
Right. Right. And the really scary thing is that this whole profit motive can actually incentivize the manipulation of the public.
It can.
Yeah.
And that's a real concern.
Yeah. I mean, your sources highlighted how media outlets can be used to evoke certain emotional responses from people. Sometimes, regardless of whether the information is actually true.
Right. And we've seen this throughout history, with propaganda.
Right.
And it's still happening today, with political rhetoric, targeted advertising, where emotional appeals are often more important than factual accuracy.
Right.
And this prioritization of emotional content, it can really contribute to polarization.
Yeah.
And makes it harder to have these nuanced, thoughtful discussions.
Right.
And then you add in the algorithms that personalize our news feeds, and it just makes it even worse.
Right, because we're not even seeing the stuff that we might disagree with.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've talked about a lot of the serious stuff, but I want to touch on something a little bit lighter.
Okay.
This idea of mainstream media creating celebrities.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's no denying that they play a huge role in that, right?
Absolutely. They provide the visibility, the distribution, and they really shape how we see these celebrities.
Right.
Through the stories they tell, the images they choose. Sometimes they even create these personas.
Right.
That aren't really accurate reflections of who the person actually is.
Yeah.
One of your sources mentioned this interesting phenomenon of people being well-known for their well-knownness.
Right, where fame itself becomes like the defining characteristic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, we've all seen examples of celebrities who are famous for being famous.
Yeah, yeah.
And, historically, print media, the Hollywood studio system, television, they all play a role in shaping those celebrity images.
Right.
But social media has really changed the game. It's kind of democratized fame in a way.
Yeah.
It allows celebrities to interact directly with their fans.
Right.
And we have all these new ways to measure fame, like follower counts and engagement. But it also brings new pressures.
Yeah.
This constant need to maintain an online presence. And this whole cancel culture thing.
Right, right.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is. And celebrities are often used as spokespeople. To promote products and ideas. And the media loves to focus on celebrity news.
Right.
Because it's easy to digest. It's that soft news that people like.
Right, right.
But the bottom line is, and your analysis really brought this home, these media-created celebrities, they have a big influence on our culture. They shape our values, our aspirations, especially for young people.
Right.
And their influence just keeps spreading.
Yeah, it does. It does. Okay, so given everything we've discussed, it's clear that we need to be really thoughtful about how we consume media. And your analysis ended with a really strong emphasis on the importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
It's essential.
Yeah.
I mean, in this complex information environment that we live in, media literacy it's our most powerful tool.
Right.
It's the ability to evaluate sources, identify biases,
distinguish between fact and opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's how we navigate this world.
Yeah. And your analysis actually gave some really practical strategies for being a more critical media consumer. Can you walk us through some of those?
Sure. The sources really stress the importance of seeking out information from multiple sources. Don't just rely on one news outlet.
Right.
Get different perspectives. Media's impact, it's global. It crosses borders, it influences cultures, it shapes our norms, our values, our behaviors. It's a powerful force.
And it's like the world is so interconnected now, right? What happens in one place can ripple out and affect people everywhere.
Exactly. So to kind of sum up this whole deep dive, we've seen how media has evolved over thousands of years. From those earliest forms of storytelling to the complexities of the digital age, there's always been this potential for power, for shaping understanding. And it's something that affects all of us.
I think it's safe to say that everyone listening to this right now, they're consuming media in some form or another, whether it's social media, streaming services, whatever. So understanding this history, it gives you context, right? It helps you navigate the information landscape we live in.
Absolutely. And that's why this deep dive was so important. By seeing those recurring themes, those patterns, you can become a more informed consumer of information.
And that leads us to a final thought for everyone to consider. Given this long history, this constant evolution of media, what role do you play in shaping the information landscape of the future?
Yeah, what responsibility do you have to be critical, to be aware of those forces trying to influence you? It's a big question, and I think it's one worth pondering.
Definitely. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
This is DigitView.